afford rent, getting gentrified. Marx in the house, about to tell you why. What up, y'all? Welcome to Marx in the House, a show where we look at housing and gentrification through a Marxist lens. Last week, we talked about how the state invested in housing to get out of the Great Depression. Remember, this investment had two objectives: capital absorption and social control. The involvement of the state was deep. It subsidized construction of houses, made mortgages more accessible to white people, and insured them as well. In 1938, they added another layer with the creation of Fannie Mae. Fannie Mae stands for the Federal National Mortgage Association. Not only did Fannie Mae insure mortgages, but they allowed banks and other lenders to pass the mortgages on. This was a huge fucking deal. This meant that liquidity was added to the housing market, since mortgages could move around from buyer to seller in a short amount of time. Liquidity here means that it's just easier to sell your shit. At the same time, mortgage interest tax deductions provided more incentives for people to go out to buy cribs and for capitalists to build more shit. Thank God, cause we're sitting on a shit ton of capital we need to absorb here. Remember, capital always needs to be circulating. So in 1929, after the Great Depression, capital circulation was brought to a minimum. There were very few outlets to invest in. Through all these acts and new organizations, the government made it easier for capital to circulate in the real estate sector. But it wasn't enough. The capitalists were in a sheer state of panic. Then, a blessing fell from the skies for capitalism: World War II. Yikes, what a system. So during World War II, the war industry was able to absorb a lot more excess, gooey capital. But as quickly as the blessing came, as fast that it went away. Unfortunately for capitalists, the war ended in 1945. Now they were in a pinch once again. You know, it's almost as if crises are reoccurring under capitalism, and capitalists need to pull off crazier and crazier shit in an endless search for profit that doesn't benefit humanity in any specific type of way. Anyway, they were in quite the pickle. What's the point of investing in commodities if no one has the money to buy them? But remember the lesson, kids. If you can't make a profit in the first commodity circuit, you go to the second one. And we're back to housing. But we have a whole class of capitalists to think of. This was gonna have to be a huge construction project all over the country. There was so much capital to invest, it's kind of dizzying. The key post-World War II figure was gonna make all this happen is actually an old friend of ours. I already covered him in my series called Marx on the Mic in episode 2. It's none other than I Hope You're Burning in Hell, Robert Moses. A system of financed highways and suburbanization would absorb all this capital that had no place to go, as well as labor. What would finance this endeavor, you ask? Debt. Everyone wins, except the working class. Just think about it. Where would all this surplus capital have gone if it wasn't for metropolitan centers like New York, Chicago, and LA? And thus, suburbanization began. This required major changes within finance. This is why all those acts from the 1930s are super important, because without people being used to all these insured and accessible mortgages, as well as subsidized construction, this shit would have never happened. Now, if you recall from when we talked about the link between gentrification and finance, nothing happens without mortgage capital. But if you leave everything solely to the banks, then you get the 2008 crisis. So we need mortgage capital, but strong support from the state too. So, what are these policies that were set up to make Robert's plan work? First of all, a GI Bill made it easier for white veterans to get cribs by giving them low-interest mortgages. There was also college education for returning white military personnel. Most importantly, Fannie Mae hooked white people up with standardized mortgages. And remember that little thing called the FHA that was set up in the mid-30s? Well, by the 1950s, 1/3 of all private housing was financed with FHA and VA loans. VA being like the FHA, but just for veterans, which in the 50s was a shit ton. Hooray, imperialism! The state also helped fund the US interstate highway system. Just to put it in context, up to that point, it was one of the biggest infrastructure projects in human history, spanning about 48,900 miles. But just guess how many of that was funded by the federal government. Just guess. It was 90%. And to this day, Americans are subsidizing suburbs for about $100 billion a year. There's highway funding, fuel and mortgage subsidies, you know the deal. All these show how the horrible project of the suburbs wouldn't have existed without the capitalist state. It also shows how the state is a tool that the bourgeoisie uses in an endless pursuit of profit. Cause regular fucking people damn sure didn't benefit from the suburbs. So that's for the production side of things. But the American government had a problem. Who the fuck was gonna move into these cribs that were inconveniently far from, well, everything? Think about it. You have to drive far as fuck to go anywhere just to be stuck in a box in the middle of nowhere. Even the rich had to be convinced to move there. Now, the bourgeoisie used several tactics to make this happen. Magazines started to feature ads in the 40s and 50s claiming the suburbs were morally good. These ads were placed by companies like Sears, who also sold books that helped you design a home, which Sears would then build. Capital absorption. General Electric placed ads encouraging white women to buy war bonds as an investment, so when their husbands got home from the war, they'd have enough money to buy a house and fill it with General Electric appliances. See, it was only in the 1940s that home ownership became the embodiment of the American dream. The suburban boom of the 50s happened at the same time that TV started to fill white living rooms. TV shows and movies like Bachelor in Paradise and Mr. Blanding's Builds His Dream Home all featured people who ended up in the suburbs. Never known to be low-key, real estate developers actually built replica Mr. Blanding cribs to sell the suburban lifestyle. The sequel, where Mr. Blandings gets sick of suburbs and moves back to the city, was written but never filmed. I wonder why. It's almost as if cultural capital moves around according to the same laws as, forget it. So who are these people being targeted for all these suburban ads, low-key and high-key? The labor aristocracy. Before I delve into this special class of people, I need to address a little base and superstructure shum. We've talked about both capital movement and race because the two are connected. Capital movement always takes place within a social context. In the US, this social context is dominated by white supremacy. This results in a racialized movement of capital. That's why most people hit by disinvestment are black and brown, and the people displacing them during gentrification are white. Access to capital is granted on a racialized basis after all. Are there poor white working class people? Hell fucking yeah, tons of them. But these are the general tendencies of capital movement. Now, after World War II, US imperialism really started to go all out. And don't worry, we'll delve more into imperialism later. Like I just mentioned, the working class is and was divided, with white workers receiving more privileges than black and brown workers. So when a section of the working class started to see more benefits from imperialist super profits, it only made sense that this was predominantly white. And this is the labor aristocracy. Again, this is a really complex class distinction, but for our purposes, just think of it like this. There's a part of the working class that's really fucking poor and has everything to gain by destroying capitalism. Then, there is a section that is technically working class but receive really high wages, which means they're kind of starting to vibe with this capitalism thing. Of course, it wasn't just the labor aristocracy, it was also the petty bourgeoisie. Again, for our purposes, we're going to use a very simple definition. This is a class of people that own means of production, but only on a really small scale. For example, you can't compare the owners of a mom and pop store and Jeff Bezos. One is petty bourgeois, the other bourgeois. Cool. The labor aristocracy and the petty bourgeoisie were literally lured into the suburbs. With their increased salaries, they were able to afford the suburban lifestyle that was sweet and wasteful. Shopping malls, refrigerators, ACs, phones, 2 cars, the production and consumption of these in the suburbs meant a huge boom to rubber, oil, and steel industries. Aside from being able to consume all the commodities produced in the post-war era, these classes fulfilled a second role. Yes, this is gonna get repetitive, which is good because it means we're detecting some patterns. See, the labor aristocracy also pacified the radical working class movement. Not only did their higher wages play a big factor, but also the lifestyle they were pushed in. Remember, capital absorption and social control. William J. Levitt, who built a famous all-white suburb on Long Island in 1948, said, "No man who owns his house and lot can be a communist. He has too much to do." Senator McCarthy, a famous anti-communist hunter, claimed that public housing would be a breeding ground for communists. Guess who supported all that state-sponsored suburban goodness, eh? The seeds of suburbanization were sown in the 1930s, and by the 1950s, it ended up being the biggest American experiment where real estate reinvigorated capitalism. The same was done in France in the 19th century, but Americans took it to a whole new scale. But so peep this, Marx in the House is supposed to tell the story of gentrification, right? So what does all this have to do with gentrification? Well, we get to place it in a new and exciting context. You see, suburbanization was the first wave of using real estate to reinvigorate capitalism. Gentrification, the second. So now all we have to do is bridge that gap. How was that switch made from suburbanization to gentrification? It was through turning houses into a liquid asset. This means that they were able to convert to money easily. Because of suburbanization, real estate became a global, corporate, nasty-ass monster. So after World War II, when capital was flying from inner cities to suburbs at a crazy pace, what was happening inside of the cities? Well, in 1949, Congress passed the Housing Act, which provided financing for slum clearance. Areas considered to be slums were torn down, but of course only if they were near major business centers. And state money wasn't just used to develop new cribs, but also businesses. Over time, all the major capitalists started to back this act. From major commercial banks, legal and accounting firms, headquarters of national and international corporations, pretty much anybody bourgeois with an interest in downtown locations. Now, of course, these housing acts are described in history books as aid to working class people in need, but here at Marx in the House, we know otherwise. For example, housing shortage was at its worst between 1930 and 1949, which is also when construction of public housing was at a low point. New housing units saw their greatest growth during the 50s, when housing shortage was actually declining. Slum clearance wasn't the only thing fucking with inner cities, so was our good old friend the FHA. The manual of the FHA promoted construction in the suburbs over inner cities. But not only that, it also actually encouraged segregation. For example, the manual stated that properties had to be occupied by the same social and quote-unquote racial classes. So how did it exactly promote construction in the suburbs? Well, there were anti-density laws which discouraged inner-city construction, but as an icing on the cake, if developers wanted insured mortgage funding, they couldn't build in cities at all. The good old FHA. And this explains the capital flight that we'd seen in Philly, the Lower East Side, and Harlem. The sum of all these policies left inner cities disinvested with black and brown people trapped in them. Because capital fleeing inner cities for the suburbs means companies did too. No companies, no employment, which of course was yet another devastating blow. And I wish that was the whole story. Not only were black and brown people stuck in the inner cities, but they were also displaced continually through these slum clearances. Remember the federally funded highways? The other half of the circuit switching coin aside from suburbanization? They were used as a handy tool to segregate the different social and racial classes. They were also nice barriers to protect land values, which of course had huge effects for gentrification later on. Social control and absorption of excess capital. The state did everything in its power to segregate inner cities and promote the construction of the suburbs. Even though it could be annoying for an individual developer not to be able to build in an inner city, we have to look at how policies benefit classes as a whole. And the promotion of the suburbs sure was sweet for the bourgeoisie. And this is what I mean when I say that the movement of capital runs your fucking life, man. Yes, culture and everything is important, but culture itself is shaped by capital. A lot of other countries during this post-war period saw this type of capital disinvestment from urban centers, which would later be followed by reinvestment. We're finally ready to break away from the national level and take it international, baby. But you know what that means. A new scale means a new historical and theoretical context. So in order for us to understand gentrification globally, we need to understand the haunting specter of neoliberalism. Stay tuned. Marx in the House is a Space Babies production. Please support us here on Patreon. Don't forget to share this video, subscribe, and leave a comment. Peace, Space Baby out.